The United States Army Air Force conducted a series of raids against the Polensky oil facilities in Romania. This seriously crippled the Nazis' ability to maintain their war machine solely because Romania was one of the main producers of the oil that the Nazis had during their entire reign. We also, of course, now move over to Italy. We have a very familiar tank for the United States during World War II, the M5 Stuart tank. Now this was a light reconnaissance tank. Now it was not fully meant to take on tanks, like especially at this point in the war where you had Panzer IVs and Panthers rolling out. It was used primarily as a light reconnaissance tank, so which meant that you can support the infantry and also conduct reconnaissance operations. Now over here we have a vehicle that is mostly associated with the North African campaign, but was used in limited amounts in Italy, the M3A1 Scout Car. Now, as I mentioned, as the name suggests, it's a scouting vehicle. Now this ain't meant to go head toe to toe with German armored infantry. And it was not particularly liked by most American servicemen, particularly because of how low riding it is and what little armored officer in the back. But it can spout a very good amount of weaponry, such as you see here, a M1917 A1 machine gun and an M2 Browning 50 caliber machine gun. The 1917 A1 is a straight out of World War I. It's the main heavy support weapon system for most U.S. infantry companies in World War II and was mounted on many vehicles including this. The M3 Scout Car, I should mention, was eventually taken out of service after North Africa solely because of the negativity it was created around it due to its obviously lack of armor. Also in Italy we have a variety of German vehicles such as the Type 82 Kubelwagen. Now this is the German equivalent of the iconic American Willys Jeep. It is thousands of these were produced all throughout the entire Nazi regime during the Nazis' 12-year reign and would see service all over occupied Europe. And of course, I should mention down here we have a very interesting variant of it, the Schwimmwagen, which is essentially a Kubelwagen Type 82, but with amphibious capabilities. This will float actually, and has propellers in the back that actually can give it propulsion. In between that, we have essentially the 20 millimeter anti-aircraft gun, as I mentioned, on the SDKF-22 armored car here, but mounted on a simple rigging. This is the Flak 36, one of the main anti-aircraft weapons used by the Nazis during the war. It is not a high altitude anti-aircraft gun. We have an example of that here, but it will be very effective against most low flying Allied aircraft. And of course then we go over here to the Arsenal of Democracy, which gets to show many of the war industry material that the United States was producing during the war, including an M4A1 Sherman tank. Now this is the early war variant. This is the most iconic and built version of the M4 Sherman during the war. Thousands of these were used by the United States and our allies during the war. The British first used these during the Second Battle of El Alamein in Egypt. And thousands more would be sent to China and the Soviet Union. And over here we have a training Sherman turret, allowing you to see inside the hatch and turret of the Sherman tank, as well as the 75mm gun, the rotor, the gunner, and the commander seat. Immediately I should mention this one is a British variant, which allows you to see a very interesting British addition to the Sherman, a smoke launcher. Now these are very unique for the British variants of the Sherman. Now we head over to the Eastern Front. We get to show off some very interesting uniforms associated with the Eastern Front, such as an officer's unit for the Waffen-SS. This one in particular is I want to say it's a captain, I believe, but I could be wrong. This one here is for a first lieutenant in the German Army Artillery, and a Russian sniper's uniform outfitted with a PPSH-43, a much more cheaper version of the iconic PPSH-41, for which there is an example here I can show on later. We have an M1910 machine gun. This was the standard issue heavy machine gun for the Soviet forces in World War II and the First World War as well. We have another variation of the Pak. This is the Pak 96. Same 75 millimeter caliber as the Pak 40, though it has a different muzzle brake and a higher velocity. These will not produce as larger numbers as the Pak 40, I should mention though. We have a PTR 41 Soviet anti-tank rifle. This is the main infantry anti-tank weapon used by the Soviets in World War II. And then we have probably one of the most iconic armored vehicles with the Soviets in World War II. The T-34-76. This is one of the most produced armored vehicles in the Soviet Union during World War II. Thousands of these were used all across the Russian front. This is the early war model though, which will be used in many of the key battles of the war, such as the battles of Leningrad, Stalingrad, Moscow, and most notably the biggest tank battle in all history, the Battle of Kursk. We have over here a German SDKF 251 half-track. Now this is the standard armored personnel carrier for the German Army in World War II. These were produced in the thousands and used across all their major battlefronts. It has the ability to mount several different weapon systems on the half-track. On this one we have an MG34 machine gun mounted in the forward firing position, and in the back we have in a anti-aircraft role an MG42 machine gun. There are several different variants of these that were mounted with different weapon systems such as flamethrowers, mortars, and even anti-tank weapons such as physically mounting a Pak 40 on this. Over here I should mention we have a very unique form of German artillery during the war, the Kneppenwerfer 41. This is an early form of rocket-fired artillery. During the war, the Americans nicknamed these screaming Mimis, solely because of the high-pitched scream that the rockets make when they are fired. And this is probably one of the most produced armored vehicles of the Second World War for the Nazis, the Stug. This one's Stug 3. These were the most built armored vehicles during the Second War for Nazi Germany. These were produced in the thousands. More of these were making actual German tanks. Now this is not a tank, to clarify, this is an assault gun. The difference between the two is that a tank has a turret which can be rotated usually in 360 degrees. This is an assault gun because the gun itself is mounted in the hull. In order to actually physically turn the gun and point it where you want, you have to turn the entire vehicle itself. These are mostly used in infantry support roles and anti-tank capabilities. Now moving towards the Clash of Steel display, which focuses on Operation Bogota, the Soviet offensives in summer of 1944. We have two of probably the most famed Second World War armored vehicles. We have a T-34-85. Now, this is the late war variant of the Soviet T-34, which we saw the early one back there with the 76. Now many of these were deployed throughout the war, post-war years as well. Many saw service in the Korean War, some even in the Vietnam War. I also should mention they have a PPSH-41 up on the turret. Over here we have probably what is widely considered to be the most famed and best tank of the Second World War, the Mach 5 Panzer Panther tank. These were considered to be the best tank of the Second World War because of its armor, its main gun, and its viewing optics. Though I should say these things do have their faults, such as most late war German tanks had numerous transmission problems. And in the case of the Panther, I should mention...
World War II in Europe will begin in 1 minute.
Shit. In the case of the Panther, the hatches on all the major positions, whether it be the tank commander, the driver, the loader, and so on, in order to open the hatches, you have to use a crank and screw the hatch open. Not particularly the best thing if you have to get the tank out of the tank very quickly, which usually is the case if it catches fire. Yeah, I don't want to be the guy driving this thing. And of course, over here we have the D-Day section. And off the bat, we have probably one of the most famed vehicles associated with the D-Day landings, an LCVP Higgins landing craft. These are used all throughout the operations that the United States and our allies used during the Second World War. This one in particular was actually used during the Normandy landings and at Omaha Beach, might I mention. Over here we have two very unique uniforms. Oh, that's the
1921.
Sneak attack on Pearl Harbor. America declares war on Imperial Japan. 3 days later, Adolf Hitler declares war on the United States. America has entered World War II. The long and brutal struggle begins in defensive 250,000 German troops roar across the densely forested Ardennes region in eastern Belgium. So swift is the German attack that it creates a bulge in the Allied line. Germans surround the town of Bastogne, cutting off paratroopers of the U.S. 101st Airborne. Patton's Third Army wheels northward. On December 26th, his forces, spearheaded by Sherman and Sherman jumbo tanks, smashed through the German attackers and freed 101st paratroopers. The Battle of the Bulge is the largest battle of the war in Europe for some 700,000 Americans, resulting in 100,000 casualties. While Allied ground forces battle across Germany, bombing raids focus on Berlin. The defense of the Reich is often entrusted to crews of Hitler Youth, League of Girls Teenagers, who are transported to defensive positions in SDK-FCA 12-ton prime movers. American and British forces cross the Rhine in late March of 1945. They are directed to secure the industrial Ruhr Valley, while the Russian Red Army moves relentlessly to capture Berlin, the capital of Nazi Germany. On April 30th, 1945, in his bunker below the streets of Berlin, Adolf Hitler commits suicide. Allies begin liberating Nazi concentration camps throughout Axis territory. The U.S. 11th Armored Division liberates the concentration camp at Mauthausen, Austria. The grim discoveries of Mauthausen and other concentration camps give new testimony to the madness spawned by Adolf Hitler and a war in Europe that has cost the lives of millions. Nearly 277,000 U.S. troops have died in the war. Over 5 million German troops have been killed. The Russians have suffered nearly 11 million troops killed in action, along with 15 million civilians. And the Nazis have systematically murdered nearly 6 million European Jews. War-weary continent celebrates the surrender of Germany. The war in Europe is over. Across the Pacific, the war still rages. 3 more months of naval engagements, bloody island hopping with its brutal combat, and the unleashing of America's most secret weapon, the atom bomb, would finally force the surrender of Japan. World War II was finally over.
Yeah, they do that every hour.
Okay.
Now, I should mention, we have two very unique uniforms here being represented. The left one, I should mention, is a German Fallschirmjäger. Fallschirmjäger is German for paratrooper. Now, these guys were very feared during the war. One notable example I should mention is Monte Cassino in Italy, which they held on to for 5 months against 4 major offensives by by a force of nearly 13 different allied nations. This one has the iconic German Fallschirmjäger helmet and smock. Well, another thing I should mention is the weapon he has slung over his chest. This is an FG-42, Fallschirmgewehr 42. Essentially, it's meant to be a replacement for the squad automatic weapon system of the MG-34 and 42. But considering how bulky they were and heavy, they chose to go this. Essentially, it's a cocked down MG-34 with a side-mounted detachable 30-round box magazine. Now, this one on the right, I should mention, is very unique. This was actually donated by our volunteer head, Colin Rocks. This is his father's uniform, who was a member of the British 79th Armored Division. A very unique British armored unit, mostly because of Hobart's Funnies. Hobart's Funnies were these weird, wacky variants of British and American tanks, such as Shermans and Churchills, that were outfitted with these outfitted for these very unique tasks. The most notable one I should mention are the DD tanks, which were amphibious versions of the Sherman tank that they developed specifically for the D-Day landings. The 79th Armored Division would see service in Normandy, Brittany, and later on during the Allied offensives against the Battle of the Bulge in Germany itself. And as we get into the D-Day landings, we have two very unique British tanks. We have a Comet, which is a British medium tank, of course. It takes a lot of the aspects from the Matilda and the Crusader tanks from the North African campaign and puts them all in one. It's outfitted with a British 6-pounder anti-tank gun that we have over there also. These are very good infantry support tanks, though they're very lightly armored in comparison to that of most late war German tanks, for which most of the time these will be fighting. But then we have the exact opposite over here, the Churchill 7. This is considered to be one of the most heavily armored tanks the Western Allied powers fielded during World War II. It has the same gun as the Cromwell, but it has more armor. However, though, it's considered to be one of the most slowest tanks of the Second World War, earning it the nickname the Walking Man's Tank, solely because the infantry could, in theory, keep pace with it at very effective speed. Now, this one I should mention is a very unique version of the Churchill tank because it's a Churchill Crocodile. In a British tank squadron, every 5th tank becomes a Churchill Crocodile. What makes a crocodile is solely because it has a flamethrower mounted inside of it. And it has a long tube that connects to this trailer, that's the trailer mount there in the back. This picture here has the actual trailer in it. Sadly, we don't have an actual flame trailer here at the museum, but this is a Churchill Crocodile. The flamethrower itself will be mounted inside the tank in the assistant driver / radio operator position. Though I should say it's in reverse because, British drives on the other side of the road. Usually it's the driver that sits on this side and it's the assistant driver that sits on the other side, but since it's British, it's the reverse. This is the assistant driver's seat, the driver's on the other side. Now here we have a British 6-pounder anti-tank gun. This is the main anti-tank gun that the British Army fielded during the war. It's mounted both the Churchill and the Cromwell tanks, as I mentioned. Uniquely, I should mention for the Normandy landings, the 101st and the 82nd Airborne Divisions of legendary Band of Brothers fame, due to a variety of different reasons, they could not take their 76mm anti-tank guns, which were the main American anti-tank gun during the war. They could not take them with them because they could not fit in their gliders. However, since the British horse glider, which the 82nd and 101st used to carry these things, could carry the British 6-pounder, the Americans trained their crews with this gun and they carried these into battle in Normandy, the Battle of the Bulge, and Operation Market Garden. Now over here we have one of the main infantry transport / armored personnel carriers that the British field during World War II. Now this is called the Universal Carrier, or as more commonly known as the Bren Carrier. It was a light, fast, and mobile, infantry transport vehicle. It has not really that much armor, I should mention. The crew compartment up there at the top, if I was to sit in there, I would be fully exposed from the waist up. Now these were used extensively by most British infantry divisions in World War II, and it had a variety of different arsenal weapon systems put on it too. And this one has a British Bren 303 machine gun mounted in the hull. There were examples mounted with flamethrowers, Piat anti-tank weapons. In the case of some examples that the Germans captured, they mounted a makeshift rocket launcher of used Panzerschrecks. This one I should also mention has been repainted for use in the British 6th Airborne Division, which was fought in Normandy and later on in Germany as part of Operation Varsity. Now we start to move right a bit more and we start to get into the Battle of the Bulge. Now this is a Jagdpanzer 38 or Hetzer. Now this was a very odd tank. Now the chassis underneath is not from a German tank. It's from a Czech-built Panzer 38T. When Germany annexed and then invaded Czechoslovakia in 1938 and 1939, they captured thousands of Czech tanks. And they took many of them and deployed them into their armored divisions. The Panzer 38T, I should mention, would see extensive service during the Blitzkriegs of 1940 and 41. But as the war progressed and those tanks started to become outdated, they started to take a lot of the old chassis and start to mount new forms of tank destroyers and tanks on top of them. In this case, they took the Panzer 38T. They took a 75mm gun, such as the PaK-40, and mounted it into the chassis of a Panzer 38T. These saw extensive service against the Western Allied powers in Normandy and elsewhere, as well as the Soviets in the Eastern Front. Now, we also got some uniforms here also. The right one is of a German army officer, part of the Panzer 39th Panzer Regiment. The left one is definitely something that most people should be familiar with. This is a paratrooper uniform, specifically of the legendary U.S. 101st Airborne Division. I feel like anyone that's probably seen Private Ryan or Band of Brothers is probably in some way, shape, or form associated with them, so I'll leave it at that. Now here we have a very unique variation of the M4 Sherman. This is the M4 A3E2 Sherman, or more commonly known as the Sherman Jumbo. What makes it unique from most other variants of the Shermans, still has a low velocity 75mm gun that is best associated with most Sherman tanks, but it has an up-armored Sherman turret. These were deployed exclusively on the Western Front during World War II. Probably the most famed Sherman Jumbo tank is one that went into Bastogne with the U.S. 4th Armored Division, because when Bastogne was being besieged by the Germans, Patton brought in the 4th Armored to spearhead the relief there, and actually we have the picture of the Sherman in question right there, marked with 1st in Bastogne. We have a M16 multiple motor carriage. This is a standard M3 half-track, the main U.S. armored personnel carrier of World War II. These were used extensively by the armored infantry for maneuverability and moving around, but this one's an M16 motor carriage because it has a quad-mounted 50 caliber machine gun mount up on the rear of the vehicle. This is one of the main anti-aircraft defense systems we had in World War II. Most notably at Remagen, these were responsible for protecting the bridge there against some of the last major Luftwaffe air attacks in World War II. Now here we have a very unique vehicle too. This is an M8 motor carriage. Now this is the chassis of the M5 Stuart, for which we already saw, mounted with a 105mm howitzer, which is one of the main forms of U.S. artillery in the war. This is not meant to be a tank-on-tank vehicle. This is meant for solely artillery usage. Then, of course, we move down this way. Now we're covering the crossing of the Rhine River itself in March of 1945. This is when the United States and the British started to experiment with the usage of very new armored vehicles, such as the Pershing, and the British with the A-34 Comet. The British 11th Armored Division would first use these during the Allied invasion of the Rhineland itself. Now this is probably it has the 17-pounder anti-tank gun that the British Sherman Firefly used during the war. But it has the speed and maneuverability of the Comet, for which we saw down there. The only thing the Americans could compare to that in terms of speed and firepower is this, the M18 Hellcat tank destroyer. Now this is not a tank. Now this is meant for fighting tanks, yes, but it lacks the armor capability of that of a medium tank. But it has speed and maneuverability and firepower where it's needed. This is a high velocity 76mm gun. It will easily penetrate the armor such as the Panzer IV and Panther, but it lacks in armor. During the Battle of Agincourt, these were very well noted for their speed and maneuverability. It was and the M18 tank destroyer battalions that were at that battle were responsible for the destruction of nearly 30 German armored vehicles. And if you want, you can go up here, you can look inside the turret itself. The M18 was an open-top tank destroyer, as you mentioned, so it had no armor on the top of the turret, meaning you can look down inside the vehicle. I would not want to be in that when the rain came, though. Another unique vehicle to be associated with the Allied invasion of the Rhineland and the crossing the Rhine is this vehicle. This is an M22 Locust. Now, it's probably one of the lightest and smallest tanks the Allies field during World War II. And that brings the question of why this was even built or used, because at this point in the war, Germans, in terms of armored capabilities, were using Tigers, Tiger IIs, and Panthers. This has no fighting chance against those. But there's a very key note why it was used. Operation Varsity. Operation Varsity was the last major airborne operation mounted during World War II. Airborne forces as a nature were meant to be a very lightly armed force, mostly fighting German infantry and tanks with rifles and machine guns, and an occasional anti-tank gun or bazooka. But what you really want as an airborne force is armor. This is where the M22 Locust came in. Now, the United States military rejected the Locust, so they gave it to the British. Typical American fashion, I must admit. So what the British ended up doing during Operation Varsity is mounting these inside their Halifax car gliders, which are some of the biggest gliders made during World War II. Essentially making these some of the first armored airborne units of all time. A few of these were used during Operation Varsity, being glided into the landing zones in and around the German town of Wesel. One of these, I should mention, saw combat with the US 17th Airborne Division. But most would eventually be returned after the operation solely because of their ineffective to fight German armor. A few of these were even lost to light German infantry weapons and anti-tank weapons. Then we start to come to the climax of the war.